And the scariest part to me of the war in Afghanistan, in terms of spending and the loss of life, the scariest part of it all is that how does it end when you have war in the historically, in the traditional way? It was war against a defined government, and at the one side ends. It ends. And the other side says, we give up. We give up. Let's get the aircraft carrier, get out the folding table, and let's sign a treaty. And it has a clear end to it. When you have a war on terror, a war on a concept, how in the world does it ever end? Who will sign the treaty? Does it not end until the last terrorist is dead? That somebody gives a news report, okay, there was one terrorist living in a cave in Pakistan, he just died, war over. Is that how it ends? If not that, then how? And therefore, the only way it can end is when simply a president or Congress declares it to end. We we created a war out of whole cloth, a war that never existed until we created it, and we can end it the way we started it, simply by declaring it. And just imagine the president who declares the war in Afghanistan to end, he will end up on Mount Rushmore because he is the first one to say, okay, I woke up in the morning and I realized it makes no sense. And that's the only way. So this is a war that has to end politically. It cannot end on the battlefield because there is no battlefield. It cannot end when the other side surrenders. There's nobody to surrender. So how is there any other solution other than a political solution, the war ending in the District of Columbia, not in Afghanistan? That's where this war must end.
Yeah, I think I would argue it's both, right? I mean, the United States envoys right now are currently negotiating a peace settlement with those in Afghanistan, and I think that makes sense, right? I mean, I certainly don't believe in the argument that many people make, the you broke it, you bought it, theory of national defense. I mean, I think there is something to that, and I think we obviously owe it to try to, leave the situation in as good of a position as we possibly can. But the problem is that, if you can't leave it in a perfect situation, does that mean you should never leave? And I would argue that the answer to that is no, that there are plenty of places in the world that have very difficult political situations that they are dealing with. And it's not the obligation of the United States to be engaged, and certainly the United States military, which, as phenomenal as they are, they're not, people don't join the military to engage in nation-building endeavors. They join the military to ultimately protect the citizens of the United States. And I think we've lost sight of that a little bit. And so, to me, that is I think it's important to look for as much of a solution and create a situation on the ground in Afghanistan that is as good and as positive a situation as we possibly can. But that shouldn't ultimately be the only thing necessary. We shouldn't have to say until things are perfect, we're not leaving, because the reality is things will never be perfect, and then we will never leave. And so, to me, that is, and I look at Vietnam in many ways as the operative example. I mean, the conflict in Vietnam was a very hard fought conflict. Perhaps in many ways the outcome was not what the United States wanted to see, but we left regardless. And if you look at the relationship between the United States and Vietnam now, 40-something years later, we trade with Vietnam. Their economy is doing very well. They're in a much different situation, I would argue, than if we were there, 45 years later, still with troops on the ground. And so, I certainly am not I understand that there are differences in Afghanistan that may prevent that outcome from ultimately happening. But I think it's instructive to realize that the idea that we can spread our values simply at the point of a gun is very flawed, and that actually sometimes engaging in these sort of soft power techniques, we end up having better outcomes. And I think that in the long term for the Afghani people, they're much likely to be better off if they can figure this out on their own. And that doesn't mean that we have to go and abandon them or, sort of be seen as being isolationist. I don't think that's the case at all. But that also doesn't mean that we have to have troops on the ground there in perpetuity.
As we go to break, Jonathan, you made reference to the Afghani people. Frankly, Jonathan, I don't really care that much about the Afghani people, what they think or what's best for them. That's the whole that is the point. What's best for the Afghani people is not relevant. It's what's best for Americans. It is our money. And as we go to break, Jonathan, I would just ask our audience to remember that the memory of Presidents Johnson and Kennedy is tarnished by starting and prosecuting the war in Vietnam. The memory of Nixon, tarnished though it may be, obviously, one of the bright spot was he ended the war in Vietnam. Nixon is not thought of as the president who surrendered, who disgraced us. He ended the war, and that is a positive attribute. So President Trump or President whoever is next, remember, you will be remembered favorably in history if all you do is end the war or wars in the Middle East.